Thank you. Thanks for filling out those evals. I know it's getting old. Thank you. I really appreciate it. So we're going to move on to talk about record keeping, especially in terms of thinking if a crop is worth it. Some of them don't earn their real estate, while others can be very, very profitable. So today's topics, a little bit about cut flower economics, reasons to keep records and setting goals, and some tips to make it more manageable and turn it into a budget. So I put this picture here. This is a picture from my peony study. One of the things we were doing is trying to advance harvest. The earliest blooming cultivars come in around Memorial Day, and we really wanted to hit Mother's Day. And so I was doing different techniques to bring them in sooner. And I wanted to include this picture to show that a lot of the record keeping we're going to talk about is taking notes, but some of those notes you can take with a picture. Pictures come with a date and you can look at it later. And so this is a really nice way to observe some visual things that were happening. You can see this is what would naturally happen in Utah. I forget when this was, March or so. I'd have to look back. And you can see these different heating techniques really made a difference. So pictures can be a really great asset. Anywho, let's go ahead and get started. So a word about cut flower economics. They can be very worth it to produce. One of the really wonderful collaborations at Utah State, so I'm a soil scientist, I work on production, but I work really closely with one of our economists, because I can say, yeah, this technique works fantastic, it'll quadruple your yield, but if it doesn't pencil out, if it costs a ton to do, people aren't buying the cut flower, then it's worthless, right? So every trial I do, I work with an economist to talk about how much that costs to do that. So some of them can be very worth it, but not all cut flowers. I put a picture of snapdragons, at least so I'm not saying this for everywhere. In Utah, they do very bad. They do not like being up in the mountains under intense sun. They did not earn their real estate, despite how gorgeous they were. Our florists also just didn't know what to do with them. That's not true for everywhere, but it's just an example. We had other ones that were very, very profitable. These were sweet peas, yeah. Thank you. Oh, thanks, yeah. Good correction. Okay, so things that we need to think about, and this is to kind of lead into taking notes. How much did they cost to produce? We'll talk about how to figure that out. And what are the sales like? So a lot to look at on this screen, but I have some published budgets. We've got more in the works. They're coming out of peer review. The trials take a few years. We like to test them for a few years to make sure it's not just a fleeting trend. So that takes a while to come out. I have this one website up here, flowers.usu.edu is an easy link. And then I also have my lab's website, which is on the last slide, smallfarmslab.com. And I put all the budgets up there. So when I produce them, we actually sell to florists through a co-op. The co-op gets 30%. My lab does get 70%, which goes back into our program to support the students. Actually, I've hired farmers into my lab off that too. And so what we do is we track all of our input costs, how much labor, how many hours of labor, what am I paying people, fertilizer, everything. We'll go through that. What are sales like? And then we calculate these budgets. So I want to point out Ruby Ward because she is the economist and she is the expertise behind these. I'm just a soil scientist. So when you look at these fact sheets, these are abbreviated tables. We talk about what the receipts were like. We track the yield to say how many stems are we producing. With these peonies, this is Coral Charm. These always sold out through pre-sales no matter how much I raised the price. I think in here we published $5 a stem, but we got up to $6. So I think that was, anyway. We just released ranunculus and we're gonna release it for field production and so forth. So they can be very worth it to produce. They've got the receipts, the costs, and then the net returns. And I put it per square foot so that it's easier. If you think about a bed of one type of flower, it's easier to relate. So $238 per square foot was our net return for field peony. And then $5 is what we ended up with ranunculus in a tunnel. This is redefining the profit potential in Utah. So tomatoes in Utah are around 20 cents per square foot. Cannabis does make more, but not many farms can grow it. Okay, enough said. So let's talk about records and accounting. Some reasons for keeping records and types of information to collect to figure out the bottom line. I really love this quote here from the flower farmer about thinking about records is just this really important thing to succeed financially. It also makes it way easier. So we always talk about pricing and we dance around the subject, but once we have these records, it's much easier to stand behind a certain price point. Okay, now I have to confess. So I like to homestead on the side. I have a lot of gardens at home and I grow a lot of things. And my habit is that I always think I'm just going to remember where I put something. I don't. I have a terrible memory. And so I've just recently been a lot better about in the evening writing down what I planted where and all of the things. And the other thing I want to point out is that, and I know I'm biased because I'm a scientist, but there's a lot of patterns that we can't realize without numbers. So I like to say that math is the language of nature. But just writing down simple numbers really help things come out, and it overcomes our bias of me just really liking that tomato or that flower. It helps us realize how productive something is or isn't. So calculating the bottom line, the questions are, is it making money? Could it make more? Maybe it's great to grow, but this other cut flower does even better and would better earn that real estate. Is something underperforming? It's also fun to look at labor and how it pencils out for these different activities. It can be a great way to justify mechanizing one part of the process if it's taking a lot of labor. So setting goals, there's never enough time in the day. I know farmers are the hardest working folks. So adding yet another thing onto the list it's intimidating and it can be kind of a drag. So I say it's important to reflect. What makes, as I go through these different methods for taking notes, what actually encourages you or inspires you and makes you think you want to do it versus what do you hear and think, heck no, I don't want to do that. When do you have a little bit more time? What do you dread it or what do you like to put off? Which crops are you most excited about? These are just fun things to ask yourself as a good place to get started. I always say start with one crop in taking notes. And I say pick the one that you're most excited about. It'll just make it easier to take notes, and then the next year can add another thing on. We come to these events and we tell you all the things, and it can be a lot. So I just think every year try to do one extra thing or one different thing. So is a crop financially worth it? Start with one crop. And these are the key things: tracking yield and tracking the economics. And so we'll go into each of those here today. I want to say it's ideal to track a given crop for 2 years because the weather can be very different year to year, which affects yield, labor, get faster at it, and so forth. So thinking about yield, one thing we have to do is define the area or the number of plants, right? If I just say peonies make me this much money, well, what's that relative to? How many plants do I have? How much room are they taking up? So here's an example with some snapdragons. So first you can define your bed or the area that you're growing. At USU, our trials aren't that big. Our beds are all 4 feet wide and they're about 40 to 42 feet long. So I know that I have this given area, right? Length times width equals area. So that's my bed size. One thing that can be helpful is to name or number your beds so that you can keep track of that from year to year. We name our high tunnels. They're really boring, 1 through whatever, but I know a lot of cut flower farmers will give names to different areas in their field. Something that's very helpful is to count the number of plants. Now you can do this by the number of plugs you plant, or you can wait to see what establishes. It's way easier to count them at this stage than at this stage when they've all grown in. So a quick thing to do is count the number of plants and just know the size of the area. So the growing season hasn't taken off yet. It's a great time to kind of define what bed you're going to track. The size of it, you can already have that ready to go. And our whole goal is to find out how productive this one cut flower is, whatever that may be. Then the next thing is recording the number of harvested stems. I've got a picture of my crew here, or past crew, working. And so I speak from a place where it's easy. I have a lot of undergrads that are going to keep track. I've got grad students who are super invested in the process. So they have to write down every single stem they harvest. They have to write down all the marketable stems, all the culls. We come up with the totals. They have to keep track of the plot. It's a lot of time. That's not realistic for farms. I know that. So this is my trick here. I say write down key dates. what date did it start coming in on? And it's up to you if you want to say when you harvested the very first stem or when it really started coming in, right? Sometimes the growth is like this. So when did it start and when did it end? That just kind of defines our season. And then it's up to you if you want to do every harvest or maybe once a week or every couple of weeks where you count the number of stems you harvested. Most flower farmers want to just mark down the ones that are marketable. They're not going to count the culls that they're throwing away. That's a great way to save some time. Something else, so Megan, when she was conducting the peony study, she would fill a certain number of stems per bucket. And so if you harvest, you put 25 stems per bucket or whatever it is, take a picture of how many buckets you have. Later on, you can come back and say, okay, I harvest about this many per week. I realized I got excited and talked really fast. Sorry about that. Slow me down at any point. So just some tips to try to come up with yield. So track your harvest with a calendar, notebook, pictures, data sheet, whatever works. Students so in my lab, I come up with the data sheets because I want them to have the harvest information in a very specific way so that I can analyze it. But I think also when I think about when I'm at home, it's way easier for me to fill something in than come up and start writing it down in the first place. So this off season is a great time to kind of come up with a data sheet. Maybe you have maybe you're not keeping track of this many beds, but maybe you've got a couple, and then you can just write in the date and the number of stems, however that works for you. I love that pictures on our phone come with a date. So again, you can take a picture and then when it slows down, really go through and look at how well it yielded. I also want to say, even though I love numbers, very nerdy about that, visual observations are very helpful and they can capture things that numbers cannot. So we just finished our ranunculus trial, and in our first year, I wanted to try these 3 cultivars, and then the rep wanted us to do Ticalote as well. So we trialed these 4 cultivars, and we took pictures, and I also asked the undergrads what they were thinking, and we just made some notes about what that flower looked like, what we thought about it, even before we took it for sale. So that was very helpful. I don't have a ton of room for my trial, so I will say this one got dropped out right away after the first year. It just didn't earn its keep. Oftentimes I give them at least 2 years, but it was too bad in our case. So then when things are slower, that's really the time to total up the number of harvested stems. And there's a few ways to do it. Again, you don't have to write all this down. I'll make sure that you get the handouts. But you can calculate it a couple ways. If you take the total number of stems that you harvested over the season and divide it by the size of your bed, you can find out how many stems were produced per square foot, or you could think of it as per bed. Both of those things work. Another way to think about it is you could say, okay, I harvested this number of stems across the season. I put this many plants in, and you can get number of stems per plant. That wouldn't make sense for something like stock, right, that you usually get just one stem from. But if you wanted to compare cultivars, that could be a really nice way to look at how productive the plants were on average. Another thing is to look at crop timing. So this is the beauty of if you write down the start and the end date, and then you have those notes over time of your yield, you can compare cultivars and crops as to when they're coming in. And sometimes that timing can be really critical. Once in a while, we'll have a cultivar that's less productive, but boy, does it come in early, and it earns its keep that way. This is a picture, by the way, of our USU farm with our high tunnels. So I want to show you an example here of one of the things we did. This is from a trial with stock, and we were looking at different cultivars. And so this is an example with total yield. So we add up all the stems that we've harvested in a season. That's what the bar represents, is how many stems. And this is for an area of 10 square feet. So you can see, and then the first set of bars is what we grew in the high tunnel. The second set of bars is what we grew in the field. I'm almost always doing high tunnel versus field for comparison, because it's just tricky in the mountains with field production. And then because my students had to calculate or measure the culls too, we have marketable and cull. So the dark color is marketable, light color is cull. And you can see that our high tunnel had more marketable than the field did. Field had hardly any. A lot of culls. And so here in 2018, we started with a 9-inch spacing. So the industry recommendations varied. We thought we'd go with 9 inches. If you look across the years, this is our least productive year per unit area. I wouldn't know that if I did it by stems per plant, right? The second year, here's 2019, and you can see our production went way up while we switched to a 6-inch spacing. So right away, I know that was a good move. We're gonna move with 6 inches from there on, especially because weather was around similar. But boy, we had a ton of calls in the field again. Really terrible showing from the field. And it was because we planted too late. We had some weather conditions that delayed harvest, and then it got extremely hot, and this is a cool season cut flower. So I advanced our planting dates even sooner in 2020. We kept our 6-inch spacing, and you can see that everything did a lot better. Our calls went down, and we had a lot greater productivity. High tunnel was still better because they came in earlier when the weather was cool. These are just some fun things that you can do with total yield. Another thing, now this is getting a little involved, but I really think your local extension agent would be happy to help you. If they can't, feel free to email me. I love data, and I'd be happy to help you crunch a little bit of it. So this is our ranunculus study with those 4 different cultivars. So I've got the cultivar as each graph here, yield per 10 square feet. And this is the date in 2020, the first year of our trial. And each of these colors represents a different planting date. So we did high tunnel, which are the blue colors, and green is the field. The darker colors mean we planted earlier. So in Utah, the recommendations from industry say that ranunculus has to be planted in the spring. The winters are too much for it. It won't overwinter. We found not only does it, but the yields are a lot better. It comes in really early, one of our earliest cut flowers. And you can see that each planting date, the yield overall went down. But what I like about these, doesn't necessarily have to be daily, but maybe weekly yield or monthly yield, is that you can see these flushes that come in. So it can make a lot of sense to do these successive planting dates. And it shows up here. It also shows us, boy, I'll take Labelle, Amidine, GG over Ticolote any day. It was really underproductive, didn't matter when it was planted. So that's something that's a little bit more involved, but it's absolutely in the wheelhouse. And again, there's a lot of folks who would want to help with those data. We're all really curious about what production is like on a small farm. So with that, I want to bring in the financial crew who helped a ton. So our economists at USU, 2 of my grad students helped the most in terms of tracking all these inputs and the yield. And then I have a bunch of farms to thank so much for reporting. So Florage and Paisley Flower Farm, they were the main people who sold our cut flowers and then told us what are the market preferences at a wholesale. What are the standards? They trained my students and me. Thank you guys. And then they also brought up information about pricing. Our co-op and our flower association also shares that information with me. So these people deserve a ton of credit for this. So expenditures. What does it cost to produce a crop? What do you need to buy to produce it? One thing that you can do, so one thing to think about is some stuff lasts more than a year. I buy fertilizer in bulk and it's gonna last a few years. It's cheaper for me to do it that way. And so what you can do is if I know this bag of nitrogen is gonna last 5 years, I can take that total cost and divide it by 5, right? So that it's annualized. It's not all in the first year, it's kind of an investment. Good idea is to write the purchase date on it, and you can just track if you're not sure how long it's gonna last. Thinking about where products are searched. There's a lot of really fancy websites that have beautiful seeds, but if you look at the cultivar and can find them somewhere cheaper, that can often help the bottom line. How much does shipping add up? That's often a deciding factor in what I'm gonna grow, is if I can get most things from one company and I'm lowering my shipping costs. We're gonna talk about this in my final talk, but there's a lot of people out there want to sell you everything but the nutrients you need to grow oftentimes, and there's not oftentimes a lot of science behind it, and that'd be a way to eliminate extra costs. Then thinking about labor. So common things that we buy for cut flowers, there's a list here. My tip is that save all your receipts. Keep them in a folder. It's hard to total all these things up, but keep them in a folder, and then when things slow down, go through and think about what you used for that cut flower that you're tracking. I've got a little example here, but we'll skip it for now. So that's a handy way to come up with input costs. Don't forget labor. Cut flowers are one of, they bring in a lot of money, but they're also one of the most labor intensive. So that's something to keep track of. In this peony study, one of the things we tested was high tunnels, and then we looked at low tunnels and high tunnels, and then we looked at soil heating, low tunnels, and high tunnels. And Megan was out there venting them all the time. So the labor costs a lot. And when I went to raise prices with florists, their first question is, why am I paying more for this before Mother's Day? And then I said, well, it's going to cost all this to start venting the high tunnel earlier, and et cetera. And then they spent the money, they did it. But they needed justification. So these are some ways that labor is used that needs to be accounted for. This is one of the things that, this might be a nice thing to reflect on at the end of the week or end of a month, how much time is being spent. If you have a list ahead of time, you can fill in the hours as you go, and that can be really useful. And then the last piece of info is, how well is it selling? Assess the market. Try to track sales and stem use. If you're selling, have receipts, stuff them in a folder. That's something that can be gone through at the end of the season when things slow down. What is the price per stem? You can estimate that if you're selling more the kind of bouquet model at farmers markets and so forth, or by the bundle to florists. Are there any holiday price bumps? And then periodically do count how much doesn't sell. How beautiful is that compost pile? To check, there can just be a lot of waste involved. Okay. Research into pricing. So there's a little bit of information. We always get questions about, what should I charge for this cut flower? So I just wanted to put this in here. One place I have found to be most useful is the Boston Terminal Market. If you Google Boston Terminal Market ornamental, it should come right up. And it looks like a text file. It's just the most basic web. It doesn't give you past dates. You have to find the archive for that. It just gives you most recently what came through wholesale and what were the prices. It doesn't have a lot of description, but it's a nice way to see what wholesale is as kind of a baseline. Talking to people is always a better way to go. And retail should be 2 to 2.5 times wholesale on average. Depends what it is. Other events, you're going to mark it up even more. I really think it's great to scrounge around and see what other people are charging. So those are my tips there. So bringing it all together, I've got some spreadsheets to show. And so these, I feel bad. So I have these, they were almost ready to go last spring, and then I completely forgot about them. So my goal for before summer, so this will be helpful, I think, next winter, is I'm going to make these publicly available. I'll make them as a fillable PDF too, where the stuff's all written out. You can just fill in the gray box. So not available yet, but it's coming, and you can do this on your own too. A template's not needed, but the idea is that you have some idea of space. What's the length, width, area? This would calculate it. How many plants? And then what's the yield? How many stems were produced? How many were sold? And it'll calculate the percent sold. We look at, so the total sales, of course, would be the number of stems sold by the price per stem. And then you can look at it as total sales per area of land, the size of your bed or whatever it is, to come up with the income per unit area. That's a really nice way to compare crops and see what stays and what goes. Then there's the expenses, and so I'll have a bunch listed here from pre-plant and prep, planting and maintenance, harvest and processing, all the things. You'll probably want to add others. How does that add up? Labor and how it divides across. Any other additional expenses? So one tip I do have, though, and when you're picking a flower, is picking an annual that is field grown is the easiest way to start. Once it's a perennial and there's those establishment costs, if it's a high tunnel and depreciation, that gets really a lot more involved, and you might need an economist to help out. So starting just easy field crop, I think is a nice way to get into this. And then ta-da, it should all, so receipts minus inputs comes to the net returns, the bottom line. And so this would calculate per amount of field space, per square foot, and then per plant. And that's just a nice way to compare. It takes the bias out by comparing by the numbers. Okay, so my summary is that farming's not easy, but record keeping is going to add work, but it adds this, it removes some of the bias, and it really can help improve the bottom line. It also helps you stand by those prices that are being set to make sure the farm is profitable or the crop is profitable. I really recommend starting small and with record keeping before extending that so you don't get burned out. Remember, pictures are awesome. Coming up with data sheets or just something to fill in, some form to fill in later helps. And with that, we are at the end of this talk. You have almost made it. Please fill out my eval, QR code, or the paper survey. I've got my lab. There's also these business cards if you want. It's got the lab website on it. And I think we have time for a couple questions.